The Washington Post newsroom delivers breaking events around the world as they happen. Unrivaled reporting from the journalists you've come to trust. To get the facts fast and meet the challenges of today head on. Get the news that matters most with a special offer by visiting WashingtonPost.com/watch. Subscribing unlocks instant access, bringing you the Post's award-winning coverage anytime, any place. Because democracy dies in darkness.
It's a critical moment for the presidency and re-election prospects of Joe Biden. Tonight, he takes reporter questions, appearing solo at a press conference for the first time in months. The purpose? The NATO summit happening in Washington. But so much is at stake for Biden personally and for his presidency, as he tries to prove tonight that he has what it takes to beat Donald Trump in November. Welcome to live coverage from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey. The press conference is now scheduled to get underway at about 7 o'clock Eastern Time in about a half hour. With me until then to lay out what is on the line are columnist James Hohmann and senior political correspondent Rhonda Colvin. We're also joined by senior video journalist JM Rieger. James, I cannot overstate how much pressure is on Joe Biden tonight. This feels like we're on this knife's edge right now. Explain why.
The presidency hangs in the balance. This is the most important news conference that Joe Biden has had in more than half a century of public life, including the 1987 news conference where he dropped out of the race. There are 6 constituencies that Joe Biden needs to reassure if his campaign is going to become viable. First, he needs to get to Democratic lawmakers who are panicking. We'll talk more about that in a second, but even today, this afternoon, half a dozen House Democrats have called on Biden to drop out. 17 House Democrats have now called on him to leave. Another half dozen have drafted statements and are planning to send them out if they don't think that Biden measures up during tonight's news conference. Biden needs to assure his own staff, which is something wild to say, not just at the White House, but on the campaign. They are dispirited, they're pessimistic, they don't see a path to victory. He needs to reassure donors. George Clooney got a lot of attention for defecting yesterday, but I hear from campaign sources that the money is drying up. It's not just big dollar, but small dollar donations too. He needs to get to the Democratic delegates, who he actually needs to vote for him to secure the nomination in Chicago in 6 weeks' time. And he needs to reach the majority of Americans who don't think he's up for this job. Ultimately, the voters who will decide in November if he stays on the ballot. Finally, he's speaking at the end of this NATO summit. He is literally standing on the world stage. Foreign leaders are watching. They're taking the measure of him and of the United States. And it's not lost on Joe Biden that there are more than 30 heads of state still in Washington as he really faces his toughest test yet. This is the biggest political crisis of his presidency, by far.
Yeah, so this is the culmination of this NATO summit. And people may be thinking, well, shouldn't the focus be on NATO? Shouldn't the focus be on the interaction that President Biden has had with these world leaders all of this week? And yet we're talking politics. Just, take a moment and explain to someone who might be wondering why this focus is on him right now.
Yeah, the stakes are really high right now. This has gotten to the level of where everything Joe Biden does, whether it's a speech, whether it's off-the-cuff remarks, everything is being scrutinized because of this question of if he is fit to continue being the candidate or the presumptive nominee for the Democrats. We've seen this sort of be something that was talked about lightly, and now it has really reached a fever pitch. And to your point about the real reason we're all here is because of the NATO summit. That's the reason why he is giving this solo presser. And I was thinking, I was on the Hill on Monday afternoon before the members flew back and started their week in Congress, and I was walking from the House side to the Senate, and I saw some of the flower arrangements being placed, the NATO flags being placed around some of the receptions, because world leaders did go to the Hill this week to talk to lawmakers. And I was thinking to myself, if it wasn't for this news on Biden, this NATO summit would really be a really big deal. Ukraine funding and assistance is something that these world leaders were gathering to talk about. That's a pretty big deal. But right now we're in a moment where people are tuning into this to watch and see what Joe Biden says, what he does, and that's what this moment is about right now.
JM, it seems like we keep saying this is a high-stakes moment. We were saying that when Biden and Trump debated 2 weeks ago. We said it last Friday as Biden had his first televised interview after the disastrous debate. And we're saying it again. Why does the pressure keep mounting here? Why do we keep kicking it to a new event that we say this is now, again, a pivotal moment?
President Biden has not done enough, at least from an optics standpoint, to sort of quell the dissent, if you will, the dissent in his party and the concern, as James pointed out off the top of the show, among Americans. The Washington Post polling average only has this race, Biden against Trump, shifting a couple of points post-debate, which normally wouldn't be that big of a crisis. But the fact that we're still talking about this debate 2 weeks now after it happened is miraculous in a lot of ways, Libby. And this is a race that is in all likelihood going to be decided by 6 or 7 key battleground states by very, very narrow margins, perhaps even narrower margins than decided the 2020 election in those states. So the reason we're still talking about this and the reason that we're focusing on these kind of granular shifts and this day-to-day nature of this is because this race is so tight. It's so tight, even after the debate. And Democrats are having a lot of soul searching right now. They're having a lot of questions about whether Joe Biden's the best person to beat Donald Trump. And there is a chance that this press conference that we're about to have at the top of the hour here, Libby, is the turning point of the Biden re-election campaign.
Rhonda, let's talk about the pressure that Joe Biden faces from Capitol Hill, where you've been all week, watching how lawmakers are talking about this, some very carefully, many in private, some in public. Why are we watching the lawmakers so closely, and what are they saying?
Well, right now, what we've seen all week, what I've seen going up to the Hill, staking out the meeting that House Democrats had on Tuesday to talk about the continued candidacy of President Biden, what we're seeing right now is that largely, in the public forum at least, House Democrats are saying they're going to stand by him. They are saying that they want it to be his choice. You're also seeing different levels of enthusiasm. You're seeing some who aren't all that enthusiastic. You're seeing some who are coming out and saying, yes, he's our guy. And then you're also seeing some kind of step back and have very muted discussions about this. But publicly, we are seeing that the majority of the caucus, at this point, the House Democratic caucus, has said that they will support him. That could change, and that's why something like tonight is really important, because this story may be a lot different tomorrow morning. We just don't know. There is a high level of uncertainty, and it is because there's a lot of anxiety of returning to a Trump presidency. Think about House Democrats and who they are. They're the people who were organizing the Russian election interference investigation in 2016 after the former president won, the 2 impeachments. They're very well acquainted with a Trump presidency, and they feel they do not want to return to that, and they don't want to risk it. They're also doing a lot of, it's almost like a political high wire act for them. Their calling card this whole term of Congress has been, we are the party of unity, stability. While the Republicans in the House have been in disarray, they've somewhat kept it together, and they don't want to lose that. So that's why you're seeing leadership like Hakeem Jeffries say that Biden is still going to be their person until he's not. We also know that House Democrats don't want to give an opening to House Republicans. This week, Chairman Comer, who is over the House Oversight Committee, they've subpoenaed Biden's aides in the White House to come to the Hill, give a deposition, and to prove what they think is a cover-up of covering up the health situation of President Biden. So you see, Republicans are taking this opportunity too. But overall, right now, we are seeing the majority of public responses from House Democrats be favorable to Biden, but that, anything could change. On the Senate side, a little bit more of a tepid response. We're seeing senators kind of be in this wait-and-see moment, Democratic senators. But there is a clip that I want to play because it happened moments ago where Senator Blumenthal, who did discuss his concerns earlier this week about Biden continuing on, he was in a special caucus meeting that they had off-Hill today with Democrats, where the Biden campaign officials came. They went over data saying this is the way we are going to win in November. And here's what Senator Blumenthal said.
Some of my concerns are allayed. Some others have been deepened. I need more of the kind of analytics that show the path to success. More important than my concerns are the questions that have been raised by the American people that Donald Trump is an existential threat. Joe Biden has to go to the American people, not just in one meeting, one press conference, one speech, but consistently and constantly. Tonight will be important.
So you see, that really underlines what we've been saying, is that tonight is very important. Lawmakers are watching it to see where they go next. There is just such a level of uncertainty on the Hill right now. Of course, James laid out that there are a lot of members who are getting ready to perhaps ask the president to step away from the campaign, let someone else go. But we're right now in territory where we just don't know where these lawmakers are going to go.
White House reporter Yasmin Abutaleb joins us now from where Biden will speak shortly at the Walter E. Washington Convention Center just down the road for here. That's where much of the NATO summit is happening. So Yasmin, give us a sense of like the TikTok, as they say, of how things are unfolding and when we might hear Biden speak.
So right now we are standing outside the room in which he's going to do the press conference. We're obviously very much delayed. There is a lot of anxiety about when it's going to start, how many questions he's going to take, who he's going to call on. Normally President Biden does press conferences where he takes anywhere from 2 to 4 questions. They're pretty short. Often the people are picked ahead of time. This time we really have no idea how many questions he's going to take. It could be 4, it could be 10. We know he's under pressure to demonstrate that he can do a full-length sort of freewheeling press conference. So I think, I'm not sure which direction it's going to head in, but we know that he's under pressure to show he can do this. And it's coming after a really full day. So I think everyone will be sort of eagerly watching to see how energetic he appears, how he's able to parry back and forth with the press. And all I can say is I have never seen this much anticipation ahead of a press conference before.
Yasmin, we haven't played this clip yet, but just a little while ago, President Biden had a verbal stumble and he called President Zelensky Mr. Putin, President Putin. He corrected himself afterwards, but what was the vibe after something like that happens?
Well, I wasn't in the room, but I had heard that there was an audible gasp after that happened. And of course, they tried to sort of play it off and quickly recover. But I think it just highlights how, these types of verbal slip-ups have happened before. And I think people normally look past them or don't put too much stock in them. It's been very, very different this week at NATO. Foreign leaders are scrutinizing every one of Biden's moves. They're exchanging notes on what he's like in private, what he's like in public, and trying to figure out, is the White House making certain accommodations? Is that just a normal thing that would happen regardless of what's happening right now? So I think it just underscores the amount of anxiety and scrutiny there is of what he seems like. Does he seem okay? Is he going to be able to take on Trump? Because the thing they fear most, of course, is Trump winning because he's threatened to shred the alliance. So I've never seen the president under this much scrutiny before.
All right, Yasmin Abutaleb, thank you so much. Yasmin will be in that press conference this evening. Stay with the Washington Post. We will bring it to you live as soon as it begins. It could begin in as soon as 15 minutes, but we will keep you posted. James, you've been thinking this week about what reporters can and should ask. What would you ask if you were in that room tonight?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be really interesting. The White House has sort of half-jokingly called this a big boy press conference. Karine Jean-Pierre said that. John Kirby, the other spokesman, said that. And basically what they mean by that is no topic is off limits. They had signaled that maybe Biden would take 6 questions. There was a lot of pushback from White House reporters saying that's not enough. He really needs to take marathon amount of questions to show that he has the stamina to show he can go back and forth. But he also needs to show that he's kind of grounded in reality. I think one of the frustrations with the George Stephanopoulos interview among a lot of Democrats, Rhonda and I have been talking to on the Hill.
And that was on ABC Friday night, a 22-minute interview.
Exactly. Was that he didn't really seem to grasp that. It feels like he hasn't really heard the complaints from a lot of people, that he doesn't really understand that 8 in 10 Americans think he's too old to be president. He admits he had a bad debate, but he was very dismissive of questions about taking a cognitive test, for example, saying I take a test every day, that's the job. But a lot of people feel like he's not passing that test every day. So I think I would want to get at there's obviously the question of can you win, but I don't think he's going to answer that straightforward. I think the second question is, can you govern for 4 more years? If you're being really stubborn right now and refusing to admit that you're slipping, how do we know that if you do win the election, and it'll be close, that you won't refuse to step aside even as you slip more and more? You'd be 86 years old in January of 2029 when your term ends. And sort of force him to answer some of that. To kind of, one of the other things he said during that ABC interview was he said, our polls don't show what all the public polls show. I don't believe that my approval rating is 36%. I think to kind of interrogate that a little bit, like, what do you think your approval rating is? What do you think your standing is in these states? Rhonda was talking about that Senate meeting, and part of the pitch that the top Biden campaign aides were making was, look, we can still hold the blue wall. Those are the states that from 1992 until 2016, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania went for the Democrats every time. Trump won them in 2016. Biden won all three of them in 2020. And that's really where the campaign is going to be this time. And Biden has basically said, I'm the one who can win the blue wall. Part of Biden's argument for why he won't step aside is that he believes privately, he tells people privately, Kamala Harris couldn't win. I don't know if he actually believes that, if that's just justification for not stepping aside. But I think one question I'd be interested in is, do you think Kamala Harris could beat Donald Trump in a head-to-head matchup? And if you don't, why is she your running mate? And if you do, why don't you step aside?
Rhonda, Biden has this high wire act he has to do from now until November. What are you watching closely?
Well, tonight, again, what James has just laid out, I really think he's going to have to bring this home to the voters, because that's who matters, really. We've had George Clooney come out and write the op-ed. Of course, George Clooney can influence some public opinion, perhaps. But at the end of the day, this is how Biden is appearing to voters. And I remember that I spoke to a voter who's from one of those swing states you just listed, Wisconsin, for some reporting that I did before the debate. And I remember he said, I just want to see that President Biden is doing well, because this voter was not enthused about Trump. So if Biden is the alternative, he's going to have to show that to the American people. And that's something that Blumenthal said in his remarks to the camera after that meeting is, it's not just going to be limited to just one press conference or one speech. It's going to have to be a string of those things in order for him to turn this around. So even tonight, even though we're talking about how this is highly anticipated, I'm not sure it's going to change much, because it's just one moment.
So it's like a make it or break it moment in a negative,
Right.
It's not, right. It's like he can hurt himself by performing poorly tonight. He can raise his confidence level, others' confidence level in him tonight, but he can't dispatch with it at this point. Is that fair to say, Rhonda?
Yeah, I think that is.
He can't just put all the worries and concerns to bed among the caucus and the people you're talking to.
That's right, yeah. And you also have to look, okay, so Biden was one of the longest serving U.S. senators. A lot of the people who are grappling with this decision whether to not make a statement as a U.S. senator about Biden, they worked with him. These are people who have often been his allies, his spokespersons on the Hill. Of course, they're voters too, and legally they can't do anything about his candidacy, but just having support and not letting this be more of a moment where more and more are detracting from him, I think is important too.
Well, we mentioned this already, but I wanted to share the tape at an event on the Ukraine compact just before we went on the air. President Biden misspoke. He introduced Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as President Putin before correcting himself. Let's watch.
Hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. We're going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky. I'm so focused on beating Putin, we got to worry about it. Anyway, Mr. President.
I'm better.
You are a hell of a lot better.
So I just have to say that is sort of a classic Biden moment in some ways, right? Because Biden's very good at sort of, the guy's been on his feet all day. He's been talking to people all week. He's very good. He has that Irish smile of I just said the wrong thing. Let me recover here. And like you were saying, James, if this had happened 2 years ago or 4 years ago.
2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago, it wouldn't be so scrutinized.
President Biden has lost the benefit of the doubt. I do think that it was a taboo a little bit, when you're talking about someone aging, and the White House was so adamant that he wasn't slipping. We obviously had been trying to report out rumors and tips that he was fading, but then now you see him in the debate, you see this here.
Joining us now is Missy Ryan, reporter covering national security and defense. Missy, good evening. Thank you for joining us. You know, there's so much focus on Biden's performance tonight, but you've been watching him all week at NATO. How has this summit gone? Let's turn the attention to that for a moment.
In some ways, it has gone well for Biden, and you would expect that this is an event that Biden can excel at. He really is in his element. He has strong partners in Europe. He has a lot of fans in the NATO alliance just because of his long history doing foreign policy, and also because he's not Donald Trump. And we all know what Trump's presidency meant for the transatlantic relationship, for NATO, because of his threats to withhold American participation from the alliance, and not his threats to not comply with the United States Article 5 commitments. And so, you know, I think that this, if there was a place where Biden's going to feel good, he's going to know the issues, this was it. And we did see that to a large extent. We heard from other leaders who were all, as our colleague Yasmin was saying earlier, who were all watching him very, very closely. We heard that he did well in private meetings, that he seemed sort of strong and sharp and on the issues. But we also heard that he did look frail, and I think that there's a lot of sort of hyper scrutiny of the atmospherics, not just what he's saying. And he did have that very strong address that he gave on Tuesday night to welcome the world leaders to the NATO summit. So, you know, I think it was a mixed bag. It certainly was much better than it could have been, you know, coming out of the debate. But there's still a lot of concern. And, you know, I think that we're going to know a lot more about how this whole event as a package deal will have gone for him after the press conference in a little while.
Missy, this opportunity to host NATO on a significant anniversary right here in Washington, D.C., was an opportunity to be a real sort of muscle flex and victory lap, as well as a show of force, because this is in many ways President Biden's sweet spot. Has that resonated? Has that come through, or has it all faded a little bit?
Yeah, no, I think it really has. You know, these are his people. These are you know, he's an institutionalist. He's a globalist. He's a guy who likes to talk about international norms. And that's what all of these people and this institution is about, particularly in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And really, you know, we have to remember that President Biden has a very strong record that he can point to in leading this coalition of countries in support of Ukraine. You know, a lot happened in the last 2.5 years that nobody thought could happen in Europe in terms of, you know, disrupting deep economic ties with Russia, of everyone coming together and isolating Vladimir Putin on the world stage. So, but President Biden has an impressive record on that front. That doesn't mean that the entire foreign policy record that he has is the same, but this is the component of his record, I think, where he could make the strongest argument. At the same time, you know, that isn't dispelling these questions that a lot of leaders have about Biden's physical state, his state of mind, and then, of course, what that means for these very closely watched elections. We had a leader from a Nordic nation in the Post yesterday, and he was saying that people in his country watch the American presidential elections as closely as they do elections in their own country, just to give you a sense of how significant they see the results of what happens in November for the rest of the world.
Pretty incredible. Missy Ryan, thank you so much. Great to talk with you. Appreciate it. You know, it is pretty incredible to think, Rhonda and James, about how NATO has not only not dwindled, it has expanded since Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And that's something that Joe Biden is proud of. But politics, Rhonda, is for many people local. It's also domestic. And Biden keeps talking about NATO in places with audiences like the AFL-CIO, when a lot of strategists want him to instead focus on the economy, focus on abortion. NATO just sort of feels like a far-off distant thing to many Americans. How relevant is this political story that's happening in Washington to people's lives?
I mean, it's really relevant, especially when it comes to the coalition and how under Article 5 we would have to respond if another member state was attacked. That's pretty important, especially with what's going on in Ukraine. We did see him outside the AFL-CIO a few days ago. It looked like a strong appearance. Again, it does show that the campaign wants to put him out there. Of course, they are managing all of his appearances, but they want to show him. And there you see it right now on your screen. He gave remarks kind of like, Joe Biden before all these questions are raised about his fitness. So again, you do see that the campaign is focusing on putting him out there. They know every moment counts. But again, and I really want to underline something that both Missy and our other colleague earlier talked about. I was talking to a Democratic member on the Hill about sort of this convergence of having the NATO summit here at the same time where Democrats are trying to figure out what to do with the Joe Biden question. And he told me he had met with some of the world leaders who are here. A lot of them are saying, behind closed doors, is America going to elect Trump again? Because we don't know if we can take that. So the question and the anxiety about Trump is not only in the United States, it's also globally, that a lot of world leaders are very concerned, especially from NATO member states, because he has made those comments. Just in February, he talked about how he would withhold military support if a member nation didn't pay their bills. And he also said that he would encourage Russia to attack a nation that had not done their financial obligation. That had a lot of NATO leaders very concerned. And I think that is all a part of the story of this week, too, is that, yes, voters in the United States, as well as world leaders, are watching what Joe Biden does because of so much anxiety about the possibility of Trump returning to the White House.
Totally fair. And yet, James, when you talk to voters, are they like, my top concern is NATO and global stability, even though it's very important to,
well, it was funny
to a lot of people
in that union clip that we just saw, he said, you're my domestic NATO.
You're my NATO. You're my NATO, right.
And
does that resonate? Is that like hitting the right notes?
It is one of his, voters actually do give him pretty high marks for his statesmanship, for how he's handled Ukraine, for rallying the world, and that's Biden's favorite part of the presidency. He was the former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. That's what he likes to do, but it is sort of reminiscent of George H.W. Bush, who had such high marks for his handling of Desert Storm in the first Iraq War, but then loses a year later because he didn't seem like he was focused on the issues people cared about, like jobs and the border, those kinds of things. And so I think Biden wants everyone to be like, wow, congratulations, this is this great accomplishment. You've made Putin pay this high price. You've helped save Ukraine. I think he would like to connect it to sort of the framework he sees as democracy versus autocracy. He's defending democracy at home post-January 6th, and he's defending democracy overseas in Ukraine. But I don't think most voters make that connection. Maybe a lot of kind of Democratic base voters do. Regular people, the people who are going to decide this election, do not.
Well, let's go to JM Rieger to talk about the latest polling information and data that we have, JM. We have a Washington Post, ABC News, Ipsos poll that is just out. What do you learn from it?
Yeah, Libby, this poll's really remarkable because it explains a lot of the dynamics that we're seeing play out right now and in the 2 weeks after the debate. The concerns about Biden, Biden's reluctance to get out, Democrats telling Biden that he needs to make a decision, Biden saying, I've already made the decision, and Democrats essentially saying, we want you to make a different decision. We can see the numbers on the screen there for our viewers. A majority of U.S. adults want Biden to drop out of this race, and that includes a majority of Democrats. That's a striking number there, Libby. And if we look at what the head-to-head looks like when we were talking about how static this race is, that Biden-Trump head-to-head, that is unchanged from our Washington Post polling in April. And that Harris-Trump number there, viewers might look and say, that's 2 points ahead. That is better than Biden, but it is within our margin of error. So it is essentially a statistical tie when we look at both of these candidates. They're bringing very similar things to the table, and that's why we found ourselves sort of in a static place here, Libby, where Biden so far has refused to budge, is refusing Democratic calls for him to drop out of this race. We'll see if the numbers change at all. I'll just note that in our Washington Post polling average, Trump has gained about 2.5 points in the 2 weeks after the debate, so a slightly bigger jump there for former President Trump. But this is a race that we expect to be decided by very narrow margins. So a static race like that, what the Biden campaign is trying to figure out at this point is where on the margins, James talked about the blue wall earlier, where on the margins, where in those key states are they seeing any slippage, and where do they need to kind of shore things up? And if it's not Biden, is Kamala Harris the person to do that?
Thanks so much, JM. James, when you look at those numbers, what does that tell you?
I mean, one of the most interesting numbers in our poll is that if Biden did step aside, who do you think should be the Democratic nominee for president in his place? Only 29% said Kamala Harris. Most people said undecided. It's not like she's the obvious person. Ultimately, this isn't going to be decided by the national popular vote. It's going to be decided in the states. And I mentioned the blue wall earlier. JM was just talking about that. Elisa Slotkin, a Democratic congresswoman who's running for Senate, told donors on a call this week that Biden cannot win Michigan. Just today, the respected Cook Political Report came out and said even the Michigan Senate race is moved in their rating from lean Democratic to toss-up. And it's because they all believe sort of the bottom is falling out, that turnout is going to drop off, that younger voters, African-American voters in Detroit, suburban voters who maybe don't like Trump, that they're not going to vote. And if you can't win Michigan, then you really, as a Democrat, don't have a path to win the presidency. And one of the things that was striking coming out of that Democratic Senate meeting was Debbie Stabenow, who is retiring, came out and said, yeah, Joe Biden can definitely win Michigan. And then other Democratic senators privately were like, no, he really can't. He doesn't have a clear path, and we need that Michigan Senate seat. So I think, we talk a lot about Democratic concerns on Joe Biden and whether Joe Biden can win, but I think it's also worth level setting that Democrats are concerned about themselves, right? They're self-interested.
Yeah,
that's I think important. Because that's what they're thinking about. If the bottom really does fall out, if people are like, Biden can't win and don't show up, so they don't vote for down ballot races that could just kill Democrats. Three of the people who came out today and said Biden needs to drop out are really telling in that regard. One of them is this woman, Hillary Schulten. She represents this Grand Rapids district. It was actually Gerald Ford's old congressional district. First-term Democrat, was defending Biden until yesterday. Today said he had to drop out. It's one of the most competitive House races, and she's clearly seeing her own internal polling. Same thing with Marie Gluesenkamp Perez in Washington, another Republican-leaning district. She actually said in the last few hours to a local TV station that Biden should consider resigning, not even finishing his term. And then the other person who in the last couple hours said Biden needs to step aside is Greg Stanton. He's actually in a safe Democratic district, but he is the former mayor of Phoenix. And he is saying Joe Biden can't win Arizona. And we know Biden can't win Arizona. We need a candidate who can. So part of what's going on is these Democrats are essentially pleading with the president to listen, is they need to convince him of three things. The first is that he can't win, that he can't beat Trump. The second is that Kamala Harris can beat Trump. And the Biden campaign is actually paying for internal polling to test Harris versus Trump. And finally, I think what a lot of congressional Democrats are trying to convince the president of, and even some of Biden's own aides, is that if Biden steps aside, it's not going to lead to mass chaos. Joe Biden was he was in his 20s during the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, the last time a Democratic president decided not to run for a second full term, and it was obviously a mess. Hubert Humphrey ended up winning the nomination, who was vice president, but then losing in the fall. Biden is telling people he's worried about that. And so these congressional Democrats, I think, are trying to say, we could pass the torch. You said you were going to be a transitional figure anyway. But it's interesting when you actually parse all these statements, they seem to be making those three different arguments that they need to convince him of.
Rhonda, your face lit up when James was talking about the self-interest of members.
I've been thinking about when talking to members, and even the story that we have on our website of some of the members coming out of that meeting being very enthusiastically behind Biden. I'm struck by the fact that the Congressional Black Caucus is very much enthusiastically behind Biden. in one sense, it's because of their personal relationship with Biden. It's also because their constituents want Biden. So that's also the flip of this, is that some Democrats don't want to defect because they know their constituents will vote for Biden because they do not like the alternative. So it does, to your point, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder at this point, where if you see a Biden gaffe, oh, he's too old to run, or you are supportive of him and you'll highlight everything he's done. If you are a member of Congress and you know you're going to be in a tight race and you're a Democratic member, you will likely be one of those who says maybe he should drop out because you are concerned about how he's going to affect the down ballot. I would also say that his effect on the down ballot is a real concern because the House Democrats have been working very hard this year trying to keep that unity, because their goal, and what I've been hearing on the Hill this week, is that they want to have the majority in the next term and elect Hakeem Jeffries as Speaker of the House. That has been something that they have really been goaling. So again, they are looking at this as, how is Biden going to affect the down ballot, whether for good or for bad? And that's really what's behind some of the defections.
Let's play some tape about Biden's high-stakes moment, why we've gotten to this point. He sat down with George Stephanopoulos of ABC News last Friday, and this was an attempt to sort of quash concerns about his debate performance the prior week and quiet the dissent within his party. But let's watch a clip.
Did you ever watch the debate afterwards?
I don't think I did, no.
Well, what I want to get at is, what were you experiencing as you were going through the debate? Did you know how badly it was going?
Yeah, look, the whole way I prepared, nobody's fault, mine. Nobody's fault but mine. I prepared what I usually would do, sitting down, as I did come back with foreign leaders or the National Security Council, for explicit detail. And I realized about partway through that, I get quoted, the New York Times had me down at 10 points before the debate, 9 now, or whatever the hell it is. The fact of the matter is that what I looked at is that he also lied 28 times. The way the debate ran, not my fault, nobody else's fault. No one else's fault.
That's a clip from George Stephanopoulos' interview with Joe Biden, the president, last Friday. JM Rieger, there was a goal there for Biden to just dispel, shut down, hit hard on, I can name a number of things: how bad he thinks Trump would be for democracy, how important it is to defend abortion rights and fight back on them, the concerns about Project 2025. But instead, he kind of meandered a bit. Tell us more.
Yeah, Libby, if you're President Biden, you've been in sort of a lose-lose in a lot of ways here, because now there is such hyper-focus on every single word, every single kind of presentation that the president gives in this interview, for example, at this press conference that's about to happen. So if Biden, you're almost kind of working towards, an unknown bar that you have to hit, if you will. Having said that, though, to your point, Libby, the interview did not do the job with George Stephanopoulos and ABC there, and as you were just touching on, the other thing that I thought was notable, it came out in our own reporting this week, was that Biden didn't show up to the debate. We talked earlier about how we're still talking about this debate 2 weeks later, which in and of itself is bad for Biden. Biden needed to shift the narrative to Trump, or at least have any conversation about him be about a good moment. Instead, we're still talking about all these concerns about Biden, and that in and of itself is a bad sign for the president. But our reporting earlier this week showed that Biden missed the walkthrough at CNN Studios in Atlanta before the debate. He was almost 30 minutes late getting there and didn't have time to show up and go through the walkthrough. And why that's important, Libby, is that the president, when he's at the lectern debating with former President Trump, our viewers might remember in that debate there were a lot of two shots, there were a lot of different there were multiple cameras in the room. The walkthrough would have told Biden which camera to look at, and there were multiple times where it looked like he was sort of looking off into the distance at nothing. And that maybe helps explain part of that. But to your point, Libby, Biden has still not met that bar. And you mentioned it just a moment ago that there's a lot of downside to this NATO presser that's about to happen. But the upside is really just maybe keeping the status quo for now, live to fight another day. He's got events tomorrow. He's got events and some interviews scheduled next week, and maybe that starts to build the momentum in his direction.
With us now is White House reporter Tyler Pager. Let's go to Tyler. Tyler, we're looking there at the convention center, the stage where President Biden will have his press conference shortly. He hasn't had a solo press conference in months, Tyler.
Yeah, this is huge stakes for the president. And we and the White House press corps have pushed repeatedly for more access to the president, the opportunity to ask him these questions. And press aides and White House officials have routinely said, well, you get a chance to shout at him when he walks off Air Force One, or he responds to questions on the rope line, and he participates in 2x2s. But this is wholly different. This is a set piece. We're expecting him to take several questions in these 2x2 press conferences with foreign leaders. He only takes 2 questions from the American press. And so this is not just a big moment for the president in terms of returning to, precedent of taking questions from the press, but obviously we're in an unprecedented moment right now where his candidacy hangs in the balance. It's not just us, the press, that are closely watching what he says. It's lawmakers, it's strategists, it's donors, it's other candidates, and it's foreign leaders around the world. There is a lot of anxiety, not just here in the United States, but around the world about what will happen in November. And world leaders are here in Washington. They know exactly what is happening among Democratic lawmakers, and they're hearing the same sorts of concerns about whether or not Joe Biden can defeat Donald Trump in November. So this press conference has global significance, and I think that's why there's so much interest and attention about what the president is going to say and how he performs tonight.
Tyler, I'm going to play a little devil's advocate here. Is the press being too crazed and tough on Joe Biden at this moment? The briefings have suddenly become very adversarial with Karine Jean-Pierre. There's been so much focus on his age, on his health, on his wellness, on his fitness. I've had regular voters say to me, is the same scrutiny being applied to Donald Trump?
Yeah, look, I think the press is appropriately responding to what we saw in the debate in Atlanta, which was the worst performance I've seen Joe Biden give, and I've covered him since 2019, seen him in hundreds of events around the world, around the country. And I think there are fair questions to ask about his state of being and his ability to do the job of president. Now, I also think we have to take a step back and look at the totality of coverage of the president. The age issue is not something that we just started writing about. We've been writing about voters' concerns about his age since he ran for president in 2020. If you look at polls over the last several months, even the last several years, Democratic voters, a majority of them have consistently said they think the president is too old to do the job. And so I think this is something that we've tried to cover. We've been routinely shouted down by White House officials, by campaign officials, saying we're too focused on the age question and not about policy and other things. I think we can do two things at once, and we have aggressively covered the president's administration, his campaign, but this is something voters have been concerned about long before the debate. And I also think, to your point about the White House press briefing, we have been given inconsistent and inaccurate answers from the White House press secretary about the president's health, about which doctors he met with, and those are, subject to public information, given that the White House publishes a log of who's coming in and out of the White House. So I think part of the reason you're seeing more aggression from White House reporters in those briefings is because there's not been transparency and honesty from White House officials about a matter that is not just of concern to the press, but clearly to voters who have for years been saying they're concerned about the president's age.
Tyler Pager, stay with us. You can see Tyler on one side of your screen, and on the other side of your screen right here, you can see the NATO floor there. It's in the convention center here in Washington, D.C., the 75th anniversary of this summit of NATO alliance, which has grown and strengthened since Putin's invasion of Ukraine. James, I just want to turn to you, but we're not going to let go of Tyler, to respond to this question of, is Trump being held to the same standard and scrutiny as Joe Biden is?
Well, I think there's an expectation of Trump, and during the debate, he said a lot of things that we've become very accustomed to hearing, but Trump was coherent. He made a lot of false statements, but they were coherent. Joe Biden was not. And I think it because Biden has been so isolated, he has such a small circle of advisors, he isn't doing routine news conferences. He's actually done fewer news conferences and interviews than any president in the history of these things being tracked, going back to Reagan. And I think it was a surprise to a lot of people because they sort of knew he was old, but they didn't realize that he was basically struggling to finish a train of thought, that he was repeating himself. And the White House was so aggressive at going after anyone who dared report what was actually going on behind the scenes that I think that made it worse for them when the American people, 50 million people watching on TV, saw for themselves just how much Biden has slipped over the last couple of years.
And there's also the argument, too, that the bar is kind of lower for the person who's not the incumbent, as well as low for Trump, because we have covered moments when he was president and also on the campaign trail where he has not been coherent, has said things that didn't seem like they had a place in whatever rally he was at. So there is that question. And to that point, I actually have heard some Democrats on the Hill who are supportive of Biden be kind of angry with the press, saying that we have not put any scrutiny on Trump or his debate performance and specifically the lies that he told as much as we've been talking about Biden's age. But I will point out, just to kind of go back to something Tyler said about the age issue with Biden is not new. It is not just this campaign. I was thinking about this the other day. I followed Biden in 2020, and I was in New Hampshire at a town hall in a school gymnasium there. And I remember a voter, when they took questions, a voter went up to Biden and said, "I'm sorry, I don't want to be disrespectful, but you cannot beat Trump, and I'm scared." Wow. And that was in 2020. And I remember talking to another voter in New Hampshire who told me that Biden just felt too old for him. So this is something that goes way back. Now, a strategist might tell you maybe they should have taken care of some of that, you know, years ago, knowing that it would be an even bigger problem now that he has aged 4 more years. But the questions about Biden's age have been pretty consistent. But again, they have kind of hit this fever pitch moment right now.
Tyler, what questions are on your mind if you were there in this press conference? What would you want Joe Biden to answer?
Yeah, our colleague Yasmin Abutaleb is there, and we've been brainstorming all day about the sorts of questions that we would want to ask him. I mean, chief among them is these questions about age, but in particular, how he responds to lawmakers in the Senate and in the House who are explicitly calling on him to step aside. Joe Biden has great reverence for elected officials. As I've written about how he makes decisions, elected officials often carry more weight in their perspective with Joe Biden than even some of his own aides. He has great respect for people who have run and won elective office. So them calling for him to step aside, particularly someone from the Senate institution he served in for more than 3 decades, has to hit a little bit harder than some of the other strategists and donor types. So I would want him to respond particularly to those complaints and criticism. But then second, also how he's going to reassure the American people that the debate performance in Atlanta was an aberration, was just quote unquote a bad night. We just saw him flub there as he was introducing Zelensky, saying President Putin was coming up to speak when it, of course, is Volodymyr Zelensky. So there are these consistent flubs that the president has had over the course of his career, but right now there's an extra harsh spotlight on him and his ability to do the job. And Democratic lawmakers that I've spoken with say he has not proven to them that this is an anomaly, that this is just the reality of what it is like to be an 81-year-old president. And so I'd want to press him on how he's going to prove that. He's often said, when we asked him about concerns about his age, he says, just watch me. But people are watching him and they're not seeing the type of results that they'd want to see or the performance. So I'd really try to dig in there on the performance question. And then also, lastly, on what his path to victory is. We're seeing public polls, we're hearing about internal polls, and the map is shrinking. Joe Biden touted his ability to win in Arizona and Georgia, these expansion states in 2020. Those states look like they are becoming increasingly more difficult, if impossible, for him to win. And so I'd want to hear him talk about what his path to victory looks like.
There is part of President Joe Biden's team right there. You can see them waiting for their boss to come, the commander-in-chief, to come in and take the stage to answer reporter questions. Thank you so much, Tyler Pager. JM Rieger, you showed us some poll numbers earlier looking at how Biden does in a head-to-head with Trump. Also, though, how Kamala Harris at this moment in time does in a head-to-head with Donald Trump. Let's talk about what Kamala Harris is up to this week and what role she is playing in the campaign at the moment.
Yeah, Libby, in that poll, 70% of Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents said that they would be, quote-unquote, satisfied if Harris replaced Biden atop the ticket. Harris has been making stops across the country. She was in Nevada and has been talking, kind of touting the campaign line, standing by Joe Biden, talking about how Joe Biden's a fighter, quoting Biden's "when you get knocked down, you get back up," which we heard Biden say the day after the debate at that rally in North Carolina. Harris is in a situation here where it doesn't do her, any good to come out and say anything other than what she's been saying, right? A lot of this is what we would expect the vice president to be saying, but given where the conversation is right now, there's always that question of, how things might change. This has been really, not even necessarily a day-by-day story, but really almost an hour-by-hour story and how quickly things have changed.
Thank you, JM. We are waiting for Joe Biden to come out. You can see there team members, top lieutenants really in Joe Biden's team from the White House. What can be going through their minds right now, James?
Yeah, so you see Jake Sullivan there, the National Security Advisor, Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, chatting with Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, Karine Jean-Pierre, John Kirby, and
this is such a huge week for them. Alone, looking at this NATO gathering, the 75th anniversary here in Washington, and now the stakes are raised so much higher even.
Well, and, I mean, this is their legacy too, right? I think that a lot of the senior staff, especially the people who've been with Biden for a while, if Biden sticks it out and loses and they stay loyal, I think they're going to have a hard time getting jobs in this town next year if Donald Trump wins and they didn't try to do something. And I think a lot of them know that, and they're clearly on edge. I mean, you can see the tension. You could cut it with a knife, and there was some what looked like gallows humor there between a couple members of the communications staff.
Now, see, I read that differently. I thought they looked so relaxed. They're so poised. They're so ready for this.
I guess there was another. The last time there was a news conference. The last time, actually, it was the three of us. We were covering Biden's presser after he met with Xi Jinping in California,
which was months ago.
It was November.
Half a year ago.
Yeah. But remember,
5 months ago.
Tony Blinken at some point, I think they had a camera shot cut to him, and he was cringing because Biden was saying that Xi is not an adversary of the United States, and you could see Blinken look uncomfortable, and so I mean it will be interesting.
Your body language.
You have to practice your body language.
There's been so much of a focus on Capitol Hill this week as Rhonda's been running around in this 90-something degree heat because lawmakers are very important voices. We have seen in the Republican Party Republicans snap in line and just stand behind Donald Trump. And if they haven't stood behind Donald Trump, they've left office, they've been voted out, some of them have even left the party. The Democrats are different, and they are trying to come to some kind of a consensus or some kind of a dialogue or conversation, but it is a very tough moment. And I want to play for you how former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi talked about Biden's candidacy. This is on Morning Joe this week, and let's listen to the nuance.
It's up to the president to decide if he is going to run. We're all encouraging him to make that decision because time is running short.
As a wise person said to me, Nancy Pelosi is clearly a mother because she is steering the course without telling exactly what to do. Here's the deal. Joe Biden has already decided what to do. He's chosen to stay in the race. So the very fact that Pelosi is saying he needs to decide tells you what, Rhonda?
That, Democrats are leaving the door open that in case he does decide to drop, they are saying that they're not standing in front of that. I think also this part of her sentence where she says, time is running short.
Yeah.
We do know Nancy Pelosi is a skilled politician herself. Yeah. She knows that every day of this is going to just get worse and worse if his candidacy is in question and every moment that he's in front of a camera becomes scrutinized. So it does seem like she might be, kind of whispering out there to not tell him to leave, but just saying the door would be open, that they would support him either way. She also knows the weight of her words because if she says something, the rest of the House Democratic caucus will fall in line. She is still a very strong leader. Not in name, she's no longer the speaker, but her presence does have command still on the Hill. So I think she's very aware that she's not going to abandon Joe Biden on Morning Joe or any other program or in the hallways of Congress. And it does show that leadership, the older members do want him to make this decision if he makes it. They don't want to be the ones to come out against him.
Yeah, it's like the decision's been made, but are you sure that's the decision? Are you sure that it's
Are you sure
not
you should
just
have another beer?
Right. It's not just leaving the door open, it's kicking open the door an extra little bit to let some light in, which gives her cover, but also raises the expectation that Joe Biden has to keep thinking this through, James, and has to keep considering. And so that got a lot of almost outsized attention in some quarters just because it was not 100% I'm with Joe Biden, full stop.
Which is what she had been saying. And she has also been telling members privately, if you're going to, basically that was a green light. But she's also said, wait until after the NATO summit, wait until after the press conference. It's sort of that, politics is supposed to stop at the water's edge. And this week, the world is here, the world is watching. Don't undercut the president while all these foreign leaders are on U.S. soil. I don't think Pelosi would have done that unless she really wanted to send a message. It's also worth noting that was it on Morning Joe, which she knows the president watches and pays close attention to those hosts. It does feel like the Biden strategy is to buy time. A couple days here, to your point from earlier, he's not going to assuage all the concerns tonight, but just as he didn't with George Stephanopoulos, but perhaps, this buys him a couple days, and then he's talking to Lester Holt of NBC on Monday. He's talking to a Hispanic network on Tuesday. He's talking to an African-American network on Wednesday. And so that maybe this kind of drags out the clock enough that there's not enough time to change horses until, all of a sudden there's just a couple weeks left until the convention. On the other hand, maybe he decides he's going to drop out right out of the Republican convention. We'll have to see how many of those elected Democrats go public. I think one of the things we've learned so far from Biden is he's not going to go quietly. He's going to sort of require that members of his party come out and say, you cannot win. It's not enough to say it privately. He's going to need, if he's going to actually drop out, he's going to need what amounts to an intervention.
Well, the question I think will be, James, is who and what will Joe Biden listen to? And is it a particular set of polls or evidence or information? Is it members of his team? Is it some of these Democratic leaders? You are watching live coverage from the Washington Post. We are awaiting this solo press conference by President Joe Biden, the first one he's done since November of last year. And there is so much pressure on him at this moment after the disastrous debate performance of 2 weeks ago. We will bring the press conference to you live and uninterrupted, and then our Washington Post team will have analysis and highlights afterwards. JM Rieger, let's go to you to talk about what we'll be watching for and listening for. Everything from the number of questions to how Joe Biden comes on stage. You've talked in the past about sort of the different sides of Joe Biden. Every politician has good nights and bad nights, but tell us about the different sides and the different versions of Joe Biden that we see.
Yeah, the question here, and the reason that the White House has been referring to this as a quote-unquote big boy press conference, among other reasons, is because Biden is expected to speak off the cuff. He's expected to take multiple questions and kind of have exchanges, if you will, with reporters, with the press. He hasn't done a lot of that. And that's going to be kind of a crucial test here because we saw the debate, we saw the ABC interview after the debate
and, Jim,
as well.
I'm going to cut you off there because we see the President of the United States walking in. We go now to the Walter Washington Convention Center here in the NATO summit and President Joe Biden.
Evening. We just concluded this year's NATO summit, and the consensus among the members was it was a great success. It was especially momentous because it represented the 75th year of the most important military defense alliance in the world's history of the world. We should never forget that NATO grew out of the wreckage of World War II, the most destructive war in history. The idea was to create an alliance of free and democratic nations that would commit themselves to a compact of collective defense. Standing together, they knew we'd all be safer. An attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. And it's worked because a would-be aggressor knows if they attack one of us, they'll be attacked by all of us. Sending that message is the best way to deter aggression and prevent wars in the first place. For those who thought NATO's time had passed, they got a rude awakening when Putin invaded Ukraine. Some of the oldest, and deepest fears in Europe roared back to life, because once again, a murderous madman was on the march. But this time, no one cowered in appeasement, especially the United States. We collected intelligence that Russia was planning to invade Ukraine months before the invasion. I directed the intelligence community to be a significant amount of intelligence be declassified so I could start building an international coalition to oppose the invasion. Then in February, some of you remember, I warned the world that the invasion was imminent. I rallied a coalition of 50 nations from Europe to Asia to help Ukraine defend itself. Many foreign policy experts thought, as Putin amassed Russian forces just 100 miles north of Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, but Putin thought it was the mother home of Russia. The capital would fall in less than a week. But the Ukrainian people, backed by a coalition to help build, stopped them. Today, Kyiv still stands, and NATO stands stronger than it has ever been. During the week of this summit, several heads of states made it a point in their statements to thank the United States and to thank me personally for all that NATO has achieved. NATO is not only stronger, NATO is bigger because we led the charge to bring in Finland and Sweden into the alliance, and it makes a gigantic difference. Excuse me. Meanwhile, my predecessor has made it clear he has no commitment to NATO. He's made it clear that he would feel no obligation to honor Article 5. He's already told Putin, and I quote, "Do whatever the hell you want." In fact, the day after Putin invaded Ukraine, here's what he said. It was genius. It was wonderful. Some of you forgot that, but that's exactly what he said. But I made it clear, a strong NATO is essential to American security. And I believe the obligation of Article 5 is sacred. And I would remind all Americans, Article 5 is invoked only once in NATO's long history, and that was to defend America after 9/11. I made it clear that I will not bow down to Putin. I will not walk away from Ukraine. I will keep NATO strong. That's exactly what we did, and exactly what we'll continue to do. Now, the future of American policy is up to the American people. This is much more than a political question. It's more than that. It's a national security issue. Don't reduce this to the usual testament that people talk about, issues of being a political campaign. It's far too important. It's about the world we live in for decades to come. Every American must ask herself or himself, is the world safer with NATO? Are you safer? Is your family safer? I believe the American people know the answer to all those questions is yes. And I believe the American people understand that America is stronger because of our alliances. I believe the American consensus from Truman to Reagan to me still holds today. America cannot retreat from the world. We must lead the world. We're an indispensable nation, as Madeleine Albright wrote. Now let me turn to three other key issues. Just this morning, we had a great economic report showing inflation is down. Overall prices fell last month. Core inflation is the lowest it's been in 3 years. Prices are falling for cars, appliances, and airfares. Grocery prices have fallen since the start of the year. We're going to keep working to take down corporate greed to bring those prices down further. Meanwhile, Trump's calling for a 10% tariff on everything Americans buy, including food from overseas, vegetables, and other necessities. And economists tell us that that would cost the average American working family another $2,500 a year. It's a tax of $2,500 a year. Second, our efforts to secure the border, southern border, is working. After Trump killed the bipartisan effort to secure the border, Republicans and Democrats had worked on, because he thought it would benefit me and make him a loser, Republicans walked away. So I took executive action last month. As a consequence, working with Mexico, border encounters have gone down over 50%. The current level is lower today than when Trump left office. Third, for months, the United States has been working to secure a ceasefire in Gaza, to bring the hostages home, to create a path for peace and stability in the Middle East. 6 weeks ago, I laid out a detailed plan in writing. It was endorsed by the UN Security Council, the G7. That framework is now agreed on by both Israel and Hamas. So I sent my team to the region to hammer out the details. These are difficult, complex issues. There's still gaps to close. We're making progress. The trend is positive, and I'm determined to get this deal done and bring an end to this war, which should end now. Let me conclude where I began. We're the United States of America. We are the indispensable nation. Our leadership matters. Our partnerships matter. This moment matters. We must rise to meet it. With that, I'll take your questions. I've been given a list of people to call on here. Reuters, Jeff Mason.
Mr. President, your political future has hung over the NATO summit a little bit this week. Speaker Pelosi made a point of suggesting that your decision on whether to stay in the race was still open. George Clooney and a handful of lawmakers have called on you to step aside. Reuters is reporting tonight that UAW leadership is concerned about your ability to win.
UAW just endorsed me, but go ahead.
Thank you. My question for you is, how are you incorporating these developments into your decision to stay? And separately, what concerns do you have about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Donald Trump if she were at the top of the ticket?
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there. Number one. The fact is that the consideration is that I think I'm the most qualified person to run for president. I beat him once, and I will beat him again. Secondly, the idea, I served in the Senate a long time. The idea that senators and congressmen running for office worry about the ticket is not unusual. And I might add, there are at least 5 presidents running or incumbent presidents who had lower numbers than I have now, later in the campaign. So there's a long way to go in this campaign. And so I'm just going to keep moving. And because, look, I got more work to do. We've got more work to finish. There's so much, we've made so much progress. Think about it. Think about where we are economically relative to the rest of the world. Name me a world leader who wouldn't want to trade places with our economy. We've created over 800,000 manufacturing jobs, 1.5 million jobs. I mean, so things are moving. We got more to go. Working class people still need help. Corporate greed is still at large. The prices, the corporate profits have doubled since the pandemic. They're coming down. And so I'm optimistic about where things are going. Danny Kemp, AFP.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to ask you about your, you mixed up Presidents Zelensky and Putin earlier today. And you now have sort of your key allies, including the British Prime Minister, the President of France, the German Chancellor having to step in and make excuses for you on that. Officials here are saying off the record that your decline has become noticeable. Hasn't this now, frankly, become damaging for America's standing in the world? Thank you.
Did you see any damage to our standing in my leading this conference? Have you seen a more successful conference? What do you think? And the Putin piece, I was talking about Putin, and I said, and now, at the very end, I said, here, I mean, Putin. I said, no, I'm sorry, Zelensky. And then I added 5 other names. Look, guys, the idea anybody suggests that we haven't had an incredibly successful conference. How many times did you hear in that conference, I know it sounds too self-serving, but other leaders, heads of state, in thanking me, saying the reason we're together is because of Biden, because Biden did the following. Look, folks, this is, well, anyway, I thought it was the most successful conference I've attended in a long time, and find me a world leader who didn't think it was. Next one, Nancy Cordes, CBS.
Thank you, Mr. President. You mentioned other instances in history where presidents have faced a challenge, but what makes this moment in history so unique is that it is not your enemies who are calling on you to reconsider your decision to stay in the race. It's your friends, supporters, people who think you've done a great job over the past 4 years. Have you spent time thinking about what it would mean for your legacy, which you've worked decades to build, if you stay in the race, despite the concerns that voters say they have, and you lose to someone who you yourself have argued is unfit to return to the Oval Office?
Well, look, I'm not in this for my legacy. I'm in this to complete the job I started. As you recall, understandably, many of you and many economists thought my initial initiatives that I put forward, can't do that, it's going to cause inflation, things are going to skyrocket, the debt's going to go up. What are you hearing now from mainstream economists? 16 economic Nobel laureates said I've done a hell of a job. That under my plan so far and what's going to happen in the future if I'm reelected, that things are going to get much better. Our economy is growing. I was determined when I got elected to stop the trickle-down economic theory, that if the wealthy did very well, everybody else would do well. My dad was a well-read, decent guy. I don't remember much trickling down on his kitchen table. Middle-class people and working-class people need help. And so what happened is I decided to was able to implement as president what I believed when I was a senator. And that is that the way to build this economy is from the middle out and the bottom up. That way we grow the economy. And the wealthy still do very well. They do fine. And guess what? Find me an mainstream economist who said we haven't done well. What have we not done that isn't working right now? And so we got more to do, though. We got to finish the job. And by the way, I come from the corporate state of the world. Delaware has more corporations registered in Delaware than every other state in the nation combined. I'm not anti-corporate, but corporate profits have doubled since the pandemic, doubled. It's time things get back in order a little bit. It's time, for example, if I'm reelected, we're going to make sure that rents are kept at 5% increase in corporate rents for apartments and the like and homes are limited to 5%. We're going to make a lot of changes that I've been talking about because we're going to continue to grow this economy. And by the way, remember how I got so roundly criticized for being so pro-union, not labor, union. Well, guess what? I've been the most pro-union labor president in history. Not a joke. And guess what? We had the Treasury Department do a study. When unions do better, everybody does better. Everybody does better. And we talk about how, for example, remember when we talked about getting the computer chip industry back in the United States? Used to be 40% of the industry. We invented the chip. 40% of the industry was in the United States. And former presidents decided that the best way to do it is find the cheapest labor in the world, send the product over there and import what the product was. And so what did I do? I was told not to go over to to Asia, including Europe, but Asia. And I remember going to South Korea, convincing them to invest $20 billion in the United States to build computer chip factories. And I asked why when they finally decided to do it. And the answer was because you have the safest economy in the world and you have the best workers in the world. So the whole idea here is We've invested, there's over $50 billion in investment in computer chip manufacturing just coming into being. None of you thought that would happen. None of you thought that would happen. But it's happening. It's happening. And it's going to grow economies all through. And by the way, red states and blue states. Matter of fact, there's as much in red states as blue states. I've made no distinction. So my generic point is that the idea that we can't continue to build and grow the economy, make it fairer. And like I said, from my standpoint, when the middle class does well, that's when the whole economy grows. The poor have a shot, the wealthy do well, but the wealthy got to start paying their taxes.
As a follow-up, sir, you mentioned that your Vice President Kamala Harris would be ready to serve on day one. Can you elaborate on that? What is it about her attributes and her accomplishments over the last 4 years that make her ready to serve on day one if necessary?
First of all, the way she's handled the issue of freedom of women's bodies to have control over their bodies. Secondly, her ability to handle almost any issue on the board. This was a hell of a prosecutor. She was a first-rate person, and in the Senate, she was really good. I wouldn't have picked her unless I thought she was qualified to be president. From the very beginning, I made no bones about that. She is qualified to be president. That's why I picked her. Felicia Schwartz, Financial Times.
Thank you, Mr. President. Presidency is the most straining job in the world, and it's 24/7. How can you say you'll be up for that next year, in 2 years, in 4 years, given the limits you've acknowledged that you have today?
The limits I've acknowledged I have?
There's been reporting that you've acknowledged that you need to go to bed earlier and your evening around 8.
That's not true. Look, what I said was, instead of my every day starting at 7 and going to bed at midnight, it'd be smarter for me to pace myself a little more. And I said, for example, the 8, 7, 6 stuff, instead of starting a fundraiser at 9 o'clock, start at 8 o'clock. People get to go home by 10 o'clock. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about, and if you looked at my schedule since I made that stupid mistake in the campaign, in the debate, I mean, my schedule has been full bore. I've done, where's Trump been? Riding around in his golf cart, filling out his scorecard before he hits the ball? I mean, look, he's done virtually nothing. And I have, I don't know how many, don't hold me to it, roughly 20 major events. Some with thousands of people showing up. And so I just think it's better. I always have an inclination, whether I was playing sports or doing politics, just to keep going, not stop. I just got to pace myself a little more. Pace myself. And the next debate, I'm not going to be traveling into 15 time zones a week before. Anyway, that's what it was about. That's what it was about. And by the way, even with that, I love my staff, but they add things all the time. At the very end, I'm catching hell from my wife for that. Anyway, I'm sorry. Zeke Miller, Associated Press.
Thank you, Mr. President. 2 questions for you. First, on the NATO summit, President Zelensky, in your meeting with him, he pressed you to lift your limitations on the Ukrainian use of American weapons, saying that, in his public remarks afterwards, saying that Ukraine cannot win the war unless those limitations are lifted. Are you reconsidering your position on that? And then secondly, following up on Felicia's question there, leaders of your own party have said that they're not worried about that debate. They're worried about the next bad night and the bad night after that. How can you reassure the American people that you are up to the task and that there won't be more bad nights at a debate stage or somewhere else?
First thing about Zelensky asking for the ability to strike deep into Russia. We have allowed Zelensky to use American weapons in the near term, in the near or abroad, into Russia. Whether or not he should be attacked. For example, should Zelensky, he's not, if he had the capacity to strike Moscow, strike the Kremlin. Would that make sense? It wouldn't. The question is, what's the best use of the weaponry he has, and the weaponry we're getting to him? I've gotten a more long-range capacity, as well as defensive capacity. And so our military is working. I'm following the advice of my commander-in-chief, the chief of staff of the military, as well as the Secretary of Defense and our intelligence people. And we're making a day-to-day basis on what they should and shouldn't go, how far they should go in. That's a logical thing to do. Second question related to
bad nights, sir. How can you reassure the American people that you won't have more bad nights, whether they be on a debate stage or it's a matter of foreign policy?
Well, I tell you what, the best way to assure them is the way I assure myself. And that is, am I getting the job done? Am I getting the job done? Can you name me somebody who's got more major piece of legislation passed in 3.5 years? I created 2,000 jobs just last week. So if I slow down, I can't get the job done. That's a sign that I shouldn't be doing it. But there's no indication of that yet. None. Who I got here? Merrick, Pulaski Radio.
Thank you, Mr. President. How are you?
I'm well.
The elections in the US have consequences around the world. You have pretty high standing in Europe. I just asked President Macron about you, and he said we are happy to have him as the President of the United States. But there is a concern. Many people in Poland and across Europe are worried that the former president may win the election. And there's a lot of concern that Donald Trump may weaken NATO, stop supporting Ukraine, or push Ukraine to give up territories to Russia.
They're correct.
And yourself was warning just 2 minutes ago about it. So my question is, do you think that Europe will be left on its own if Donald Trump wins the election? And what's your advice to European leaders to prepare for possible US disengagement?
Well, look, I think, how can I say this without sounding too self-serving? I'm not having any of my European allies come up to me and say, Joe, don't run. What I hear them say is, you've got to win. You can't let this guy come forward. It'd be a disaster. It'd be a disaster. I mean, I think he said in one of his rallies, don't hold me to this, recently, where NATO, I just learned about NATO, or something to that effect. Foreign policy has never been his strong point. And he seems to have an affinity to people who are authoritarian. That worries, as I tell you from Poland, that worries Europe. That worries Poland. And nobody, including the people of Poland, think that if he wins in Ukraine, he's going to stop in Ukraine, that that's going to be the end of it. And so what I can say is, I think I'm the best qualified person to do the job, to make sure that Ukraine does not fall, that Ukraine succeeds, that the European alliance stays strong. You may recall, no one was talking about Finland joining NATO. I remember talking to Putin right after we got elected in Geneva, and he was talking about what we should do. We couldn't be in Eastern Europe, et cetera. And I said, you're looking for the Finlandization of Ukraine, as you're going to get the NATOization of Finland. And about 4 weeks later, I got a call. That's not true. Probably 5 months later, from the president of Finland, could he come and see me? In my office, I invited him to the Oval Office. We sat down and talked. He said he wanted to join NATO. Could I help? And I did. It wasn't automatic. And then I got a call from the Swedes. Beg your pardon? And so Finland joined NATO, 800-mile border is a significant, and they were already allies, but they weren't part of NATO. And you heard, I think you heard, maybe, I can't recall what he said in public in our closed meeting, but he wouldn't mind being repeated. He said, we decided in Finland, the people of Finland decided they had to be part of NATO. It was in our interest because of the joint ability to be together, to dissuade any attack on Finland. And the same thing with Sweden. It took a lot of selling to some folks, particularly in Turkey and other places, to agree to the expansion. But it expanded. And we're a hell of a lot stronger because of it. We're more secure because of it. And by the way, I was able to get 50 other nations, 50, to support Ukraine. 50. And we were able to bring about a coalition of Europe and Asia, Japan and South Korea. I just we talked about AUKUS, and we talked about the relationship between Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, the United States. We're making the world safer and stronger because we have to deal with the new arrangement that exists in the world. The Cold War is over. The post-war era is over. What is going to replace it? And I respectfully suggest I have a pretty good idea what that should be. I've convinced a lot of people to follow it, and we're just going to get stronger. David Sanger. Where's it?
Thank you, Mr. President.
Be nice, David.
Mr. President, the NATO declaration that was issued yesterday was very notable because it described China as a decisive enabler of the war in Ukraine for its provision of critical goods to the Russians. That's part of a broader partnership that seems to have cemented in place in the past 2 or 3 years. I think one that you were a little bit doubtful of when we asked you about it some time ago. So I'd be interested to know whether you have a strategy now of trying to interrupt the partnership between China and Russia, and whether or not in a second term you would pursue that, if you could describe that strategy to us. And along the way, could you also tell us whether you think, just to follow up on Felicia's question, that if you were in a room with Vladimir Putin again, the way you were 3 years ago, or with President Xi, that a few years from now you will be able to go negotiate with them, handle them one-on-one?
Well, the first part of the question is, we discussed and I raised in the NATO summit, and others raised, the future of China's involvement, what they're going to do, what they're doing with Russia in terms of accommodating, facilitating them. They're getting access to additional, they're not supplying weapons themselves, they're supplying mechanisms for them to be able to get weapons. And China's position is basically, and I've spent more time with Xi Jinping than any world leader has, over 90 hours since being vice president all the way through, for real. And by the way, I handed all my notes. But my point is that Xi believes that China is a large enough market that they can entice any country, including European countries, to invest there in return for commitments from Europe to do A, B, C, or D, or not to do certain things. What's happened is we had a long discussion about what we have to make clear. China has to understand that if they are supplying Russia with information and capacity, along with working with North Korea and others to help Russia in armament, that they're not going to benefit economically as a consequence of that by getting the kind of investment they're looking for. And so, for example, we're in a situation where, and we've reestablished direct contact with China after that, remember the balloon, quote unquote, going down, all of a sudden things came to an end? Well, we set up a new mechanism. There's a direct line between she and me, and our military has direct access to one another, and they contact one another when we have problems. The issue is that we have to make sure that she understands there's a price to pay for undercutting both the Pacific Basin as well as Europe, and as it relates to Russia and dealing with Ukraine. And so we, for example, if you want to invest in China, as you know this area really well. If you want to invest in China, you have to have a 51% Chinese owner. You have to make sure that you do by their rules. And you don't have the authority, and you have to provide all access to all the data and information you have. There was a while there, as you recall, the last administration and other administrations, where the access to that market was enticing enough to get companies to come in because they had access to over 1 billion people in a market, not 1 billion, but a lot of people in the market. And so they were doing it. But that got curtailed when we started saying we're going to play by the same rules. For example, the idea they don't abide by the international rules related to subsidizing products by the government funding. So guess what? They're not going to be able to export their electric vehicles to the United States without a significant tariff. Others are doing the same thing around the world. But it is a concern. It is a concern that you have both China, North Korea, Russia, Iran, countries that are not necessarily coordinated in the past, looking to figure out how they can have impact.
Interrupt that impact?
Yes, I do, but I'm not prepared to talk about the detail of it in public. And I think you'll see that some of our European friends are going to be curtailing their investment in Russia. In China, as long as China continues to have this indirect help to Russia in terms of being able to help their economy as well as help them in, as a consequence of that, their ability to fight in Ukraine. The other thing that we talked a lot about is that, and I raised it, and I didn't hear any. I can't swear that everyone agreed because not everyone got to talk about it. But we need a new industrial policy in the West. For example, we talked about how both the EU as well as NATO has to be able to begin to build their own munition capacity, has to be able to generate their own capacity to provide for weapons and the ability to. It came as a surprise to some of us how we had fallen behind in the West in terms of the ability to construct new material, new weaponry, new everything from vehicles to weapon systems. And so one of the things that came out of this was we're going to be meeting again with a number of my colleagues, my European colleagues, is what do we do to increase the capacity of the West, particularly in Europe and Japan, to be able to generate the kind of ability to produce their own weapon systems. Not just for themselves, but to be able to generate that. It's the same, it's what Russia's trying to figure out. That they went to China and they didn't get the weapons, but then they went to North Korea. But we're going to be in a position where the West is going to become the industrial base for it to be able to, the ability to have all the defensive weapons that we need. That was a discussion as well.
Mr. President, I'm not sure you answered on whether you would be ready to go deal with Putin and Xi 2 or 3 years from now.
I'm ready to deal with them now and 3 years from now. Look, like I said, I'm dealing with Xi right now and direct contact with him. I have no good reason to talk to Putin right now. There's not much that he is prepared to do in terms of accommodating any change in his behavior. But there isn't any world leader I'm not prepared to deal with. But I understand the generic point is Putin ready to talk? I'm not ready to talk to Putin unless Putin's ready to change his behavior. And the idea, look, Putin's got a problem. First of all, in this war that he is supposedly have won, and by the way, I think, don't hold me to the exact number, but I think that Russia had 17.3% of Ukraine that they conquered. Now it's 17.4. I mean, in terms of percentage of territory. They've not been very successful. They've caused horrible damage, loss of life, but they've also lost over 350,000 troops, military, killed or wounded. They have over 1 million people, particularly young people with technical capability, leaving Russia because they see no future there. They've got a problem. But what they do have control of is they are very good at controlling and running the public outcry that relates to how they use mechanisms to communicate with people. They lie like hell through the constituencies. They lie like hell about what's going on. And so the idea that we're going to be able to fundamentally change Russia in the near term is not likely. But one thing for certain, if we allow Russia to succeed in Ukraine, they're not stopping in Ukraine. I recommend, I know you know this because you've written about it, read Putin's speech after they moved in, what it was all about in Kyiv. It wasn't about just, anyway, read what his objective is. And anyway, but so I think that I'm prepared to talk to any leader who wants to talk, including if Putin called me and wanted to talk. Last time I talked to Putin was trying to get him to work on an arms control agreement related to nuclear weapons in space. That didn't go very far. So my point is, I'm prepared to talk to anybody, but I don't see any inclination. There is an inclination on the part of the Chinese to keep in contact with me because they're not sure where this all goes. And look what's happened in Asia. We have strengthened the Asian Pacific area more than anybody else has. We just put together with, today I brought on, I asked our NATO allies that we bring on the group from the South Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Australia. I already mentioned Australia. And I met twice now, I think, with the 14 leaders of the Pacific Island nations. And we've slowed down what's going on there. We've slowed down China's reach. But there's a lot of work to do. This is a moving target, and I don't take it lightly. Assam from NPR.
Thank you, Mr. President. Asma Khalid with NPR. I have two questions. Earlier, you spoke about the ceasefire plan between Israel and Hamas. We're now looking at 10 months of war, and I'm curious if there's anything that you feel personally you wish you would have done differently over the course of the war. And then secondly, if I may, I wanted to ask you about your presidential campaign. I remember covering your campaign in 2020, and there was a moment where you referred to yourself as a, quote, bridge candidacy, a transition to a younger generation of leaders. I want to understand what changed.
Two things. Let's go back to when you talked about would I have changed anything that's happening with Israel and the Palestinians and the Palestinian movement. The answer is, as you recall, from the very beginning, I went to Israel, but I also got immediate contact with al-Sisi in Egypt. I met with the King of Jordan. I met with most of the Arab leaders to try to get a consensus going as to what had to be done to deal with getting more aid and food and medicine into into the Gaza Strip. And we pushed it really hard. And Israel occasionally was less than cooperative, number one. The Israeli War Cabinet, I've been dealing with Israel since Golda Meir. Some of the reporters around here cover me all the time have heard me say this. The first time I met with Golda Meir, I sat across from her at her desk, and her assistant was Rabin sitting next to me. That's how far back I go. I know Israel well, and I support Israel. But this war cabinet is one of the most conservative war cabinets in the history of Israel. And there's no ultimate answer other than a two-state solution here. And so what was able to be done in terms of the plan I put together was it would be a process for a two-state solution. And we get the Arab nations to, particularly from Egypt all the way to Saudi Arabia, to be in a position where they would cooperate in the transition so that they could keep the peace in Gaza without Israeli forces staying in Gaza. The question has been from the beginning, what's the day after in Gaza? And the day after in Gaza has to be, the end of the day after has to be no occupation by Israel on the Gaza Strip, as well as the ability for us to access, get in and out as rapidly as you can, all that's needed there. I've been disappointed that some of the things that I've put forward have not succeeded as well, like the port we attached from Cyprus. I was hopeful that would be more successful. But that's why when I went to Israel immediately after the massacres that occurred at the hands of Hamas, the one thing I said to the Israelis, and I met with the War Cabinet and with Bibi, don't make the same mistake America made after bin Laden. There's no need to occupy anywhere. Go after the people who did the job. You may recall, I still get criticized for it, but I was totally opposed to the occupation and trying to unite Afghanistan. Once we got bin Laden, we should have moved on, because it was not no one's ever going to unite that country. I've been over every inch of that, not every inch, the entirety from the poppy fields all the way to the north. I said, don't make the same mistake we made. Don't think that's what you should be doing, is doubling down. We'll help you find the bad guys, Sinwar and company. And all this criticism about I wouldn't provide when the weapons they needed. I'm not providing them 2,000-pound bombs. They cannot be used in Gaza or any populated area without causing great human tragedy and damage. But remember what happened when you had the attack on Israel with rockets and ballistic missiles. I was able to unite the Arab nations as well as Europe, and nothing happened. Nothing got hurt. It sent an incredible lesson to what was going on from the Middle East. So there's a lot of things, in retrospect, I wish I had been able to convince the Israelis to do. But the bottom line is we have a chance now. It's time to end this war. Doesn't mean walk away from going after Sinwar and Hamas. And if you notice, you know better than most, there is a growing dissatisfaction on the West Bank from the Palestinians about Hamas. Hamas is not popular now. And so there's a lot of moving parts. I just have to keep moving to make sure that we get as much done as we can toward a ceasefire, and get those. And by the way, look at the numbers in Israel. I mean, my numbers are better in Israel than they are here. But then again, they're better than a lot of other people here too. But anyway.
Bridge candidacy in 2020, you referred to yourself as being a bridge candidate for a younger, fresher generation of Democratic leaders, and I wanted to know what changed.
What changed was the gravity of the situation I inherited in terms of the economy, our foreign policy, and domestic division. And I think, I won't put words in anybody's mouth, most presidential historians give me credit for having accomplished more than most any president since Johnson and maybe before that to get major pieces of legislation passed. And what I realized was my long time in the Senate had equipped me to have the wisdom to know how to deal with the Congress, to get things done. We got more major legislation passed that no one thought would happen. And I want to finish it, to get that finished. If tomorrow, if we had a circumstance where there was a lineup and I hadn't inherited what I did and we just moved things along, anyway, it's going to change.
Last question.
Haley Bull, Scripps. Or no, Josh Weingrove, I'm sorry, was the next one. I'll do 2 more questions.
Thank you, Mr. President. Many of your colleagues, Democrats on the Hill, are watching tonight as they assess what they want to say about your candidacy. I'm wondering how you're thinking of this right now. It seems like your answer is clear, but they're watching how things go tonight, tomorrow in Michigan, next week in Texas and Nevada. Are you thinking that way about how the next week or 2 goes would inform your
Am I using that way, you say?
Are you thinking that way about how the next 2 weeks go? Will that affect your decision, or are you fully determined on running in November as the party's nominee?
I'm determined on running, but I think it's important that I allay fears by let them see me out there. Let me see them out. For the longest time it was, Biden's not prepared to sit with us unscripted. Biden's not prepared to, anyway. And so what I'm doing is, and I've been doing, I think we've done over 20 major events from Wisconsin to North Carolina to demonstrate that I'm going out in the areas where we think we can win, where we can persuade people to move our way, or people are already there. And here, look, the other thing is, we have the most extensive campaign organization of anybody's had in a long, long time. We have well over 1,000 volunteers knocking on doors, making phone calls, making tens of thousands of phone calls. We have headquarters, I forget exactly how many, I don't want to cite a number and then find out I'm off, but we have scores of headquarters in all the toss-up states. We're organized, we're moving, and that's awful hard to replace in the near term. And here's the other thing. I was in the Senate a long time. Very proud of what I've done in the Senate. I was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee for a long time, and I was chairman or ranking member and chairman of the Judiciary Committee. I'm going to be going down to the Johnson Library. Anyway, I'm going to be going around making the case of the things that I think we have to finish and how we can't afford to lose what we've done or backslide on civil rights, civil liberties, women's rights. There's that little button we have. Control guns, not girls. I mean, the idea we're sitting around, this is where Kamala's so good as well. We're sitting around. More children are killed by a bullet than any other cause of death. The United States of America. What the hell are we doing? What are we doing? We got a candidate saying, promise the NRA, don't worry, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to do anything. You got a Supreme Court that is what you might call the most conservative court in American history. This is ridiculous. There's so much we can do still, and I'm determined to get it done. It's about freedom. And by the way, I'll end this. Well, I'm not going to do that. Haley has to come up too. But I remember I made a speech on democracy in Philadelphia at Independence Hall. And I'm not being critical, just observing. The bulk of the press said, what the hell is he talking about that for? Democracy. You did. Democracy is not an issue. Democracy is not an issue. Except the polling data showed 60% of the people knew I was right, thought I was right. I'm not asking you a question. You don't have to answer, obviously. But do you think our democracy is under siege based on this court? Do you think democracy is under siege based on Project 2025? Do you think he means what he says when he says he's going to do away with the civil service, eliminate the Department of Education? make sure, I mean, we've never been here before. And that's the other reason why I didn't, you say, hand off to another generation. I've got to finish this job. I've got to finish this job because there's so much at stake.
We've had some discussions over the past few days with your press secretary about the question of health exams. And you said you take a cognitive test every day in this job. Are you open to taking another physical or test before the election? Governor Whitmer of Michigan, for instance, said it wouldn't hurt to take a test.
Well, look, two things. One, I've taken 3 significant and intense neurological exams by a neurologist. In each case, as recently as February. And they say I'm in good shape, okay? Although I do have a little problem with my left foot because it's not as sensitive because I broke my foot and didn't wear the boot. But I'm good. I'm tested every single day about my neurological capacity, the decisions I make every day. You talk to my staff, all of you talk to my staff. Sometimes my staff talks a lot. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think you have them telling you that all the major ideas we've undertaken haven't been in part initiated by me. I remember when the staff, I said, I'm going to go to South Korea. We're going to get the chip. What are you doing? I'm going to get Japan and Korea back together again after essentially having hostilities toward one another since the end of World War II. I'm going to move and see that we can expand. You know, the only thing age does is help you with it. Creates a little bit of wisdom if you pay attention. And so the point I'm making is, I think it's important that if the neurologist tells me he thinks I need another exam, and by the way, I've laid every bit of the record out. Hadn't hidden a thing. You ought to ask Trump for his, okay? I laid it all out. And every single day I'm surrounded by good docs. If they think there's a problem, I promise you, or even if they don't think it's a problem, they think I should have a neurological exam again, I'll do it. But no one's suggesting that to me now. And I'll ask you another question. No matter what I did, no one's going to be satisfied. Did you have 7 docs? Did you have 2? Who'd you have? Did you do this? How many times did you? So I am not opposed if my doctors tell me I should have another neurological exam, I'll do it. But that's where I am. Haley Bull, Scripps.
Thank you, Mr. President. You said you're making decisions on a day-to-day basis when it comes to support for Ukraine. Does that mean you have not closed the door on further considering lifting restrictions for U.S.-made weapons inside Russia? And if I may, your convention is coming up where your delegates are pledged to make you the official nominee. If they have second thoughts, are they free to vote their conscience?
Obviously, they're free to do whatever they want, but I get overwhelming support. Overwhelming support. I won, I forget how many votes I won in the primary. Overwhelming. And so tomorrow, if all of a sudden I show up at the convention, everybody says, we want somebody else, that's the democratic process. It's not going to happen.
Even if that means they vote for someone else?
Sure. Look, I'll end this with this. I served in the Senate a long time. I understand the impetus of candidates running for local office and whether they think the topic can help them or not. In my state of Delaware, which was a very, at least it was a red state when I started, in terms of where you now talk red and blue. I don't recall most of the Democratic presidents winning my state when I was a candidate. The truth of the matter is I understand the self-interest of every candidate. If they think that, running with Biden at the top is going to hurt them, then they're going to run away. I get it. But so far, go and look at the polling data in their states. look at the in-depth, and by the way, I think you'd all acknowledge, and you're all experts. I'm not being solicitous about the president. You're experts on this stuff. How accurate does anybody think the polls are these days? I can give you a series of polls where you have likely voters, me versus Trump, where I win all the time. When the unlikely voters vote, he wins sometimes. The bottom line is all the polling data right now, which I think is premature because the campaign really hasn't even started. I mean, it hadn't started in earnest yet. Most of the time, it doesn't start till after September, after Labor Day. So a lot can happen. But I think I'm the best I believe I'm the best qualified to govern. And I think I'm the best qualified to win. But there are other people who could beat Trump too. But it's awful start from scratch. And, you know, we talk about, you know, money raised. We're not doing bad. We got about $220 million in the bank. We're doing well. So with that, you want to follow up on any of that you just asked me?
Yes. You earlier explained confidence in your vice president.
Yes.
If your team came back and showed you data that she would fare better against former President Donald Trump, would you reconsider your decision to stay in the race?
No, unless they came back and said, there's no way you can win. Me. No one's saying that. No poll says that. Okay. Thank you.
This ends tonight's press conference. Thanks, everybody. This concludes.
Respectfully, earlier you misspoke in your opening answer. You referred to Vice President Harris as Vice President Trump. Right now, Donald Trump is using that to mock your age and your memory. How do you combat that criticism from tonight?
Listen to him.
This concludes tonight's press conference. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, everyone.
President Joe Biden walking off the stage at this historic NATO summit. The president holding his first press briefing, his first solo press conference since November. He took questions from 10 reporters. The press conference lasted just shy of an hour. Now, Biden did mix up some names and words, as you heard NBC's Peter Alexander referring to there at the very end. That reporter jumping up to say you were at the very beginning trying to say your Vice President Kamala Harris, and instead you said Trump instead of Harris, but you heard just there how Biden pushed back against that. Even though he mixed up some words, Biden made a focused and forceful case for his politics and agenda, saying he's not running for re-election with a mind to his legacy, but to complete the job he started. Now, he did acknowledge that it's important to allay the fears of his political allies, and he said he still believes he's the best person to defeat Donald Trump. I'm Libby Casey, and this is coverage from the Washington Post. I'm with James Hohmann, Rhonda Colvin, and JM Rieger. Let's stay in the studio here first, James, to get your reaction to how tonight went.
Tonight's performance was better than the debate, and you heard the president make clear that he has no intention of dropping out anytime soon. Now, he's always going to say that until he doesn't, but this was someone who just spent nearly an hour taking questions. I think a dozen different people asked questions, but there were a lot of multi-part questions. And he does have, I mean, this is his comfort zone when it comes to foreign policy, NATO. He showed dexterity when talking about Russia and Ukraine and China. And yes, he mixed some names up. He's always mixed some names up. I think this is one of those things where if you want to call for Joe Biden to drop out, you could pick some reasons to do that from this. If you want to find a reason to support Joe Biden, you can watch the totality of that and say, I'm sticking with Biden. I am not sure that that's going to calm a lot of the anxious nerves on Capitol Hill. I think Biden actually almost gave permission to Democrats in that second to last question, where he said, look, I understand the impetus of local politicians, and I came of age in Delaware when it was a red state, so I understand if some people want to distance themselves from me. I think that that was a strategic decision, that he's saying that because he knows a lot of people are going to run away from him, and he has no intention, as of now, of stepping aside.
Rhonda.
Yeah, it didn't appear that he has intentions to step out of this race. He was somewhat defiant. He pushed back at some of the questions. There was that one back and forth where one reporter said, "You've said that you've had limitations," and he said, "When did I say that?" And he explained about, he's just pacing himself. To your point, and we said this at the top of the show, I'm not sure what one press conference can do. If you already said you think somebody else should run, you probably feel that way or will continue to. And as I said earlier in the show, a lot of this is all in the eye of the beholder, especially for other politicians who are wondering, do they want to be on a ballot with Joe Biden? Is he going to hurt their chances? So it's really up to how people perceive this. If he has other opportunities like he just did, that might stave off some of the criticism a little bit, because it was a pretty strong press conference. You did see his command on issues of foreign policy. Of course, he led the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. This is an area of expertise for him, and I think he relished in that. He also gave a lot of time to reporters. This was not one of those, I was wondering if it would be just a few questions and managed questions, and then he would, step off the stage. But he did take time. He even asked one of the last reporters, do you want to ask follow-ups? Which, covering politicians for a very long time, they often don't ask you that. So it seems as if he knew what the moment was. He knew what he had to do. I don't know if this will lead to any other immediate defections from Democrats, but again, a lot of this is just how people are perceiving it on their own. We'll see where it goes. But, I don't think there were any major issues that we will be talking about tomorrow.
Yeah, let's bring JM Rieger into the conversation. JM, President Biden talked about some things that many Democrats have been eager to hear him talk about for a couple of weeks now. Project 2025. He talked around abortion a little bit, but he did applaud Kamala Harris for her role in advocating for the freedom of women's bodies, meaning abortion as well as birth control and other things. So how do you judge his ability tonight to focus on the issues that he and Democrats want to focus on?
One of the things that Democrats especially have wanted the campaign, they've said this publicly over and over again over the past week, they want Biden to go out and make the case. And part of that means giving a succinct, elevator pitch, if you will, to voters about why Biden and not Trump in this election in kind of a dual head-to-head race. We heard a few moments tonight where he did that in this press conference, talking about Project 2025, talking about what changed when he was asked at one point about, he said he wanted to be a change candidate, a transitional candidate when he was running in 2020, and he said, quote, "What changed was the gravity of the situation." He laid out his record tonight. We heard that over and over again. What was interesting, and James and Rhonda sort of made reference to this, was at the end he was sort of asked if he would give, what he would tell delegates who were maybe wavering. We've heard some reports in the last day or two about Biden campaign outreach to delegates that are pledged to him ahead of the Democratic National Convention, and he said that they are free to do whatever they want. Now, whether that, as James was referring to, whether that, opens the door even more here, is perhaps a question that comes out of this. I don't think Biden was going to come into this and sort of quell the doubts, if you will. I think that, if you're Biden, you can't really, he's under the microscope at this point. It's sort of hard to prove a negative, if you will. But I think he did broadly what he needed to do, and what will tell us how this story shapes up, how this campaign kind of shapes up here, is what comes in the days and weeks ahead here.
James, you had set us up before President Biden spoke with the terms of he can do more damage tonight if things don't go well. But he can also sort of staunch the bleeding. He can control things, and they can get to the next milestone. They can get to the next milestone after that. So has President Biden managed to move the bar down the road at pace so that people will be looking yet to the next milestone?
Yes, I think he did. It is an open question of how many House Democrats are going to come out in the next 72 hours before that interview with Lester Holt airs on Monday on NBC and say Biden needs to go. And then the Republican convention is going to sort of change the storyline a little bit. That does sort of buy him a week where the attention will turn to who Donald Trump's going to pick as his running mate. And you saw Biden keep the door open a little bit. He clearly defiant, clearly plans on running. But he said if delegates want to oppose me on the convention floor, even if they're bound to me, they can. If people want to distance themselves from me, they can. If people want to show me data that shows I can't win, they can. That it's not someone who's like moving toward getting out, but it's someone who isn't fully closing the door. And I think that's because all these prominent people are saying you've got to get out. And so he knows he needs to, as he said, allay their concerns rather than just dismiss them, which is frankly what he did in the interview with George Stephanopoulos on ABC. He was dismissive. I still think that he's clearly in denial about a lot. You heard him kind of do the polling truther thing again, where he basically says he doesn't believe the polls that show his approval ratings at 36% and that he's losing in every battleground state. And I don't know who is going to get through to him that he really is. I don't know if it's going to take 30 House Democrats coming out to convince him, or if it's going to be staff or the campaign. And we are going to continue to see fresh polling that might show the bottom really starting to crater, which has not happened yet.
Rhonda, you're going to be listening with your ear to the ground to a lot of members of Congress, and the shift really will be turning to the RNC, the Republican National Convention, which starts in just a few days in Milwaukee. But do Democrats have a little bit of time now? Have they bought themselves some time here through Biden's performance tonight, through the success of the NATO conference that's just wrapping up, so that they don't have to make any major decisions in the next 24 hours or 48 hours?
Yeah, that's right. The spotlight will be on Milwaukee next week, so that does kind of buy them some time to strategize, talk amongst themselves. Congress is actually out next week. But I don't know if there was any damage that would make them sort of, come out tomorrow morning with, mass defections. I do think that there might be some breathing room before we continue to hear about any defections. But, I really think the delegate point is a very important one, because that's where the focus should be shifting very soon. Yes, we've heard from lawmakers. Yes, we've heard from celebrity donor and actor George Clooney.
I almost thought you forgot George Clooney's name for a minute there, Rhonda.
But I wanted to explain that he is also
yes,
a donor, and that is
absolutely
what made his op-ed significant to some. But really, this goes to what's going to happen at the DNC. And if there is a continuation of talk about Biden's age, his fitness for the office, how does that affect delegates? They're in control, really. And there was this Atlanta Journal-Constitution did a report yesterday where they polled the delegates from Georgia who are going to go to the DNC. And the lead sentence said that one delegate said that they would continue to vote for Joe Biden if he was on life support. Another delegate said they would vote for a piece of wood over Trump. So again, there still might be some enthusiasm with the base that really isn't being reflected in what lawmakers are saying.
I guess the question with that is it because they just so desperately don't want Donald Trump, or is it out of loyalty to Joe Biden, right?
It could be a little bit of both, but I think we're living in times where there's just so much anxiety about a Trump return to the White House among a lot of Americans. And I think that that's what's amplified the Biden age issue. As we've talked about, issues with Biden's age, his gaffes, that's been going on for years. But right now, it's at really the height of it because of who the opponent is and how many Americans would prefer that he not return to the White House.
Well, a few questions tonight about Kamala Harris and her abilities to rise to the presidency, Biden's choice to pick her as VP. There was also talk, as JM mentioned earlier, about Biden's original characterization of himself in 2020 as a transitional figure, someone bridging the gap between two generations of politicians. So let's listen to some of that exchange tonight and how Biden had talked about himself as a transitional candidate. Let's listen to more.
And I wanted to know what changed.
What changed was the gravity of the situation I inherited in terms of the economy, our foreign policy, and domestic division. And I think, I won't put words in anybody's mouth. Most presidential historians give me credit for having accomplished more than most any president since Johnson and maybe before that to get major pieces of legislation passed. And what I realized was my long time in the Senate had equipped me to have the wisdom to know how to deal with the Congress to get things done. We got more major legislation passed that no one thought would happen. And I want to finish it, to get that finished.
That's President Biden earlier at his press conference answering a question from NPR reporter Asma Khalid, addressing this question of his commitment to being a transitional candidate who now wants to run for re-election and keep the Oval Office. So, JM, reflect for me on how President Biden answered that. And, you had talked about his need to give a crisp, clear mission statement and a purpose that we really didn't hear during the debate or even the George Stephanopoulos interview. Is this that moment here?
I think he started to take steps towards that moment, Libby. I mean, I think that's correct, what you just mentioned, which is Democrats are clamoring for him to get to this moment of make the pitch, make the elevator pitch against Trump that we can go out and campaign on. I want to read part of a quote from an earlier question that sort of ties into that as well. He was asked about, his legacy, and he said that was not, kind of his primary concern in terms of how he's thinking about, this equation of whether he should stay in the race or not here. I just want to make also a quick point on the timeline here, Libby. If you're kind of the Biden campaign, if you're Democrats at this point, we're waiting on a Trump vice presidential nomination announcement at some point in the coming days here, definitely within the next week, we would expect. Republican National Convention next week. As Rhonda mentioned, Congress is out next week. So if you're the Biden campaign, you seem to have bought yourself some breathing room here in terms of kind of the focus of the story in a lot of ways, getting off of this kind of 2-week-long stretch post-debate on Biden's acuity and strength and fitness in office. And now it shifts a little back towards former President Trump. This is also important because there is sort of a tentative deadline, as our reporting has shown, in early August, when there's going to be this vote from the delegates to nominate Biden, and then we have the Democratic National Convention in August as well. So this is quickly approaching here. So you would, and what our reporting shows is that if Biden stayed in after that, it would be much more difficult to replace him potentially on state ballots after the Democratic National Convention. So what we're talking about here is about a 4 to 5 week stretch that is sort of the crucial timing for this question of if, when, how Biden gets out of the race here.
James, did Joe Biden make a clear, concise, crisp case here about why he should be reelected? There's been this critique and criticism of looking back rather than looking forward. And as he tried to tackle this and answer the question, he also hit on this thing of legacy. As JM mentioned, we've heard we've heard some Democrats saying, get out now, preserve your legacy. And here he is saying, my legacy is not what's important, it's winning re-election.
Yeah, and you actually heard him make a forceful case at the top. I think, the teleprompter version, the first 7 minutes where he said, look, today's inflation report was great, the economy's growing.
Something we haven't even talked about,
exactly.
Which is crazy. Those were
Huge
really good numbers for them, yeah.
Border encounters down 50% since he implemented this new executive order on immigration, the progress toward a ceasefire to end the carnage in Gaza. And the challenge that you hear from the Biden loyalists is, come on, Democrats, stop focusing on this age thing and trying to push him out, because that means that you can't tell the story. And that is an open question. There is going to be this drip, drip, drip. Just moments after the news conference ended, Jim Himes, who is the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee from Connecticut, put out a statement clearly written before the news conference saying Biden needs to step aside and pass the torch right away. And it was clearly he was waiting till the press conference was over. And so if you have a couple, if you have 3 a day for the next 10 days, how do you pivot? You heard him even at the end when he asked the Scripps reporter, do you have any follow-ups? And Biden was trying to make it about Donald Trump, trying to say, ask Trump for his medical records, ask Trump what he would do. And I think that is the Biden strategy. It has been going back to way before the debate, but it's become incredibly challenging because now that Biden has lost the benefit of the doubt, every time he has a gaffe and a malapropism, it's going to get a heck of a lot more attention than it did before.
Well, let's listen to one of those flubs in his commentary after he got off the teleprompter and was beginning to answer questions. In fact, the very first question, Biden mistakenly referred to Vice President Kamala Harris as, quote, Vice President Trump. Let's watch.
What concerns do you have about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Donald Trump if she were at the top of the ticket?
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there. Number one, the fact is that the consideration is that I think I'm the most qualified person to run for president. I beat him once, and I will beat him again. Secondly, the idea, I served in the Senate a long time. The idea that senators and congressmen running for office worry about the ticket is not unusual. And I might add, there are at least 5 presidents running or incumbent presidents who had lower numbers than I have now, later in the campaign. So there's a long way to go in this campaign.
That's President Joe Biden earlier in that very first question he was asked, mistaking and mixing up the names Harris and Trump. Didn't catch himself. Peter Alexander, NBC reporter, pointed it out at the very end. And once again, Biden tried to push it back to return the conversation to Trump. But the reason Peter Alexander in this question incorporated, like, Donald Trump is using this right now on social media to go after you and make fun of you, Rhonda.
Yeah, you know, and that would be expected. He did say Vice President Trump, and then I noticed he also said, I wouldn't have picked her. So it does.
It just was a word flip. Yeah, right.
So I don't know how deeply any of us should analyze this, because I know I've misspoken. And if he was asked, you know, a 2-part question where Trump's name was mentioned, Harris's name was mentioned, it may not even be an age thing. It just may just be a person just mixing up what was going on there. So I don't know if that's something to deeply analyze, but of course that does give ammunition, because we live in a world where everything can go viral very quickly, and just a snippet can be taken out, context can be left out, and then just go viral and help your opponent. So again, this is why every moment seems to be very important right now.
And the cough, you know, that cough he's had for a long time, that persistent cough. It is just the visual. I mean, if you read a transcript of that, you'd be like, oh, he messed up the word. But it is he presents old. He's 81 years old. He's our oldest president. He would be 86 at the end of his second term. He is frailer than he was even a year ago. And the spotlight is just going to be a lot brighter on these flubs now than it used to be following the debate.
James, I want to bring this back to where this all started, which was the conclusion of the NATO summit, which was, by the accounts from those who attended, a success. We've talked about how NATO has evolved and in fact grown since Putin invaded Ukraine, which really might have been unfathomable just a decade ago or even 5 years ago, frankly. There's frustration. There's going to be frustration from people who support President Biden and saying, you know, there should be more focus on the success of this conference, on the things that Joe Biden was talking about at the very beginning of this press conference. So put in context for us the message that the Biden campaign and Biden administration want to transmit with everything that is going to be the focus of sort of speculation and questioning.
In some ways, the NATO kind of growth, if you will, that you're talking about, Libby, and the resistance to Russia's invasion of Ukraine might be the biggest foreign policy accomplishment of his presidency, and we heard him talk extensively off the top of this press conference about those accomplishments, or about what he would argue are his accomplishments. We heard him talk extensively about foreign policy, and we also heard him talk again about how he views America's role in the world, and you know, that's what these news conferences are really valuable for, if nothing else, is sort of getting a window into how these leaders think about these key issues and how they're going about making their decisions. You know, in the weeks ahead here, Libby, I think that, you know, the real question is, how much is this age issue just baked in, and how much is he not going to be able to shake it? It's been a remarkably static race so far, and for now, the top of the ticket is static as well.
Rhonda, closing thoughts from you tonight.
I think that's really the headline that's not being talked about a lot, is that our polling, as JM talked about earlier in the show, does show that this race is still static. We've been talking a lot about what lawmakers are saying and all of that. That does hurt Joe Biden in a public image way, and also with divisions in his own party. But this all lies within the voters. And so that's what we're going to have to look at right now to see if there are any shifts. And of course, the race being static is concerning for Democrats because they feel they should be a little further ahead than Trump. But at the same time, nothing seems a lot further ahead. But at the same time, nothing has truly changed with the people being polled. And I think that's really a story we should be talking about.
That is fascinating. Yeah. James.
A top Democrat who's a close ally of the Biden campaign has held his fire, has not called on Biden to get out, texted me during the news conference, and he said, you can see Biden's knowledge and moral clarity as he talks about NATO, foreign policy is his comfort zone, but it's so frustrating that his ego is threatening to undermine all of the progress that he's made on NATO, all of his great success, and ultimately could put the whole NATO alliance at risk if Biden ends up sticking it out, losing in November to Donald Trump. Trump comes in and upends NATO. You know, what Biden says he's not thinking about his legacy, but in this Democrat's view, maybe he should be.
Well, we'll be watching the polls. We'll be watching to see how Democrats respond, and we'll be preparing to pivot our attention to the Republican National Convention next week. Well, that wraps up our Washington Post coverage of this press briefing, this press conference that Joe Biden had, his first solo press conference. It lasted just about an hour. He took 10 questions, and it was this moment for him to show voters, as well as show the American public and the audience of the NATO alliance, that he has what it takes to not just finish the presidency, but do it all over again come January of 2025. We'll continue to cover the aftermath of this in the pages of the Washington Post, of course, in the coming days. And please join us next week as we're live in Milwaukee at the Republican National Convention. Our coverage begins Monday at 7 o'clock Eastern Time and goes every night at the convention through Thursday, when Donald Trump will, we expect, accept the nomination. We will see you soon. I'm Libby Casey. Special thanks to Rhonda, James, and JM.
The Washington Post newsroom delivers breaking events around the world as they happen. Unrivaled reporting from the journalists you've come to trust. To get the facts fast and meet the challenges of today head on. Get the news that matters most with a special offer by visiting WashingtonPost.com/watch. Subscribing unlocks instant access, bringing you the Post's award-winning coverage anytime, any place. Because democracy dies in darkness.